The wind that swept across the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1889 had a voice. It was not a gentle whisper. It was a dry, insistent moan that carried the scent of pine from the high country and the cold premonition of snow. It scoured the silvered sagebrush flats, rattled the windows of the newly built timber train station, and hummed a lonely tune along the single telegraph wire that stretched east and west, a fragile nerve connecting this raw place to the rest of the world. Ada Merrick felt that wind the moment she stepped down from the train, her city boots sinking slightly into the dusty earth of Sagebrush Crossing. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet composure of a woman accustomed to being overlooked, a useful trait she had cultivated. One hand steadied her hat, while the other clutched the handle of a worn leather satchel. Inside, nestled among lesson plans and a well-loved volume of poetry, was a letter from the Union Meridian Railroad Company. It was sealed with a formidable wax stamp, granting Miss Ada Merrick, the town's new schoolteacher, the authority of a civil surveyor. She was there to observe, to listen, and to recommend the final route for the new rail line, a decision that held the power to create fortunes or to erase a man's entire world from the map. Her larger trunk, filled with books that smelled of paper and home, was unloaded onto the platform with a heavy thud. It seemed a flimsy bastion of education against the vast, indifferent landscape of gray plains and stony buttes. She watched as a man with a small, quiet boy loaded it onto a wagon. The man's hands were thick and calloused, the knuckles scarred from labor that was both unending and unforgiving. He moved with a heavy economy of motion, his shoulders burdened by more than just the weight of the trunk. This was Cole Harding, though Ada did not know his name yet. At 33, his face was already etched by the sun and by a sorrow that had settled deep in the lines around his eyes. He farmed a small spread in the valley, a place he was trying to hold together for his son. Jonah, the boy, only 6 years old, stood by the wagon wheel, his gaze fixed on a stray dog. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since the winter fever had taken his mother, leaving a silence in their small cabin that was louder than any storm. Cole finished his work, took his pay with a silent nod, and lifted his son onto the wagon seat. He did not look at the new schoolteacher. In his world, arrivals from the east were like summer storms. They made a lot of noise and then they passed, leaving the land unchanged. Ada arranged for her things to be taken to the boarding house and made her way toward the center of town. A single dusty street lined with a mercantile, a smithy, a saloon, and the hopeful facade of a new bank. A town market was in full swing, a chaotic but vibrant tapestry of ranchers selling livestock, farmers with their late harvest vegetables, and trappers displaying pelts. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat, frying sausages, and the sweet aroma of cinnamon rolls from Ruth Tabor's bakery. Mrs. Tabor, a woman whose kind eyes missed nothing, offered Ada a warm smile and a pastry, a silent welcome to Sagebrush Crossing. It was then that chaos erupted. A tethered horse, startled by a dropped blacksmith's hammer, reared back with a terrified snort, its eyes rolling white. The rope snapped. The animal bolted, careening through the crowd, scattering people and produce in its wake. Ada found herself directly in its path, frozen for a half-second too long. A strong hand suddenly clamped around her arm, pulling her back with a force that was rough but certain. She stumbled against a solid chest as the horse thundered past, its hooves churning the dirt where she had just stood. She looked up into the steadiest, most honest eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of the prairie grass after a rain, set in the sun-weathered face of the man from the train station. His hand was still on her reins, not her arm, she realized with a flush of embarrassment. He had snatched the trailing leather straps from the air. His knuckles were bruised, but his grip was iron. He let the breath he was holding out in a slow hiss, his gaze fixed on the horse as it was finally cornered by other men. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, touched with a dry wit that was as much a product of this land as the sagebrush itself. He asked her if she was trying to let the whole winter out of her hands. The question was so unexpected it startled a genuine, shaky laugh out of her. Her own reply was soft, a confession that she was only trying to let go of fear. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was necessary. He seemed to see not just a frightened woman from the east, but something more. He released the reins to another man and then tipped his hat to her, a gesture of ingrained courtesy. He said nothing more before turning to find his son, who was watching the entire scene with wide, silent eyes from the safety of the bakery doorway. Ada's heart was still hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that was only partly from the near accident. The encounter had left her feeling strangely exposed, as if that brief, intense gaze had seen past the schoolteacher and glimpsed the surveyor hidden beneath. The market's commotion began to settle, but a new energy was building near the town hall. Silas Vane stood on the steps, a man in his 40s whose tailored suit looked out of place against the rough-hewn timber of the buildings. He was a land and mining speculator, and he moved with the predatory grace of a man who saw this territory not as a home, but as a treasure chest waiting to be cracked open. His voice, slick and confident, carried easily over the murmuring crowd. He spoke of progress, of prosperity, of the great iron artery of the Union Meridian Railroad that would pump wealth into their town. He painted a picture of a bustling future, of new businesses and rising land values. Then, he got to the heart of the matter. He announced that he, as a community benefactor, had a proposition. His geologists had found promising silver deposits in the hills, but they were worthless without a rail spur to transport the ore. That spur, he explained, needed to run through the flat, easily graded land of the South Valley. He held up a hand, and a small, velvet pouch was placed in it. He opened it and poured a stream of glittering stones into his palm. He told the crowd that for those who stood with him, for those who supported the new route, there would be rewards like these. He called them diamonds, a promise of a brilliant future. Then his other hand came up, holding a sheaf of papers. He declared that for those who stood in the way, for those whose stubbornness blocked the path of prosperity, he had these, he called them deeds, legal instruments to acquire their land for the greater good. A wave of murmurs, a mixture of awe and unease, rippled through the onlookers. Ada watched their faces. She saw the hunger for an easier life, the weariness of constant struggle against drought and frost. She saw the gleam of avarice in some eyes, and the flicker of fear in others. Then she saw Cole Harding. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his quiet son holding tight to his leg. He was not looking at the glittering stones or the menacing papers in Silas Vane's hands. He was looking at the valley, his valley, with an expression of grim, unyielding resolve. Ada felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She looked at the official map tucked away in her satchel, the one showing the two proposed routes. One, the Red Willow Pass, was difficult, mountainous, and expensive. The other, the one Silas Vane was championing, ran straight through the heart of the valley, straight through the small ranch belonging to the man with the calloused hands and the honest eyes. Her secret mission was no longer an abstract exercise in engineering and economics. It had a face. It had the face of a weary father and his silent son. Her responsibility to the company demanded an impartial assessment. Her conscience, however, was already taking sides. The prosperity Silas Vane offered felt as cold and hard as the stones in his palm. Later that evening, in her small room at the boarding house, Ada lit a lamp. The wind pressed against the glass, a constant, lonely companion. She spread the map on her small desk. The two lines, one black and one red, seemed to scar the innocent paper. The valley route was cheaper, faster. It was the logical choice, the one her superiors in Omaha expected. The Red Willow Pass route would protect the handful of small farms in the valley, but it would cost the Union Meridian an extra 4 months of labor and a small fortune in blasting powder and trestles. She thought of the conflict she had seen brewing, Cole against Silas, a man's simple desire to keep his home against another's ambition to build an empire. The whole town was caught in the middle, seduced by the promise of wealth, and she, the quiet schoolteacher, was the fulcrum on which it all turned. Sheriff Pike, a man who seemed more interested in keeping the peace than enforcing the law, would surely bend to the will of the wealthiest citizen, and she had already met his cousin, Edwin Pike, the handsome and polished owner of the new bank, whose attentive gaze made her feel more like an asset to be acquired than a person to be known. Cole stood on his porch, watching the last light bleed from the sky. The hay was cut and stacked, but an early frost could still ruin the winter grazing. He had a payment due at Edwin Pike's bank, and his pride was a bitter pill. To ask for an extension felt like admitting defeat, but to refuse might mean losing everything. He looked down at Jonah, who was sitting on the steps, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. The boy's silence was a constant ache in Cole's chest. He knew he had to protect him, but he was beginning to understand that protection meant more than just a roof and a warm fire. It meant preserving a way of life, a legacy of self-respect written in the very soil beneath their feet. That was something Silas Vane, with all his money and influence, could never comprehend. Just as Ada was preparing to blow out her lamp, a sharp rapping came from downstairs. A few moments later, the boarding house owner brought up a thin, brown envelope. It was for her. A boy from the new telegraph office had just delivered it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The message was brief, transmitted in the clipped, impersonal language of the wire. Expecting your route recommendation. 10 days, UMRR. 10 days. The wind howled, and the deadline felt like a closing fist. The choice was hers. She could deliver prosperity to Sagebrush Crossing and ruin to an honest man. Or she could choose a harder path, one that would earn her the wrath of powerful people like Silas Vane and the disapproval of her own employers. The weight of it all, of the town's future and a family's survival, settled upon her shoulders. The secret she carried was no longer a simple duty. It was a profound and terrible burden. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust, greenwood, and the earnest, soapy scent of 20 children scrubbed clean for a day of learning. It was a single room, a testament to the town's hope, where 6-year-olds struggled with their letters in the front rows while 12-year-olds wrestled with long division in the back. Ada moved between them, a calm presence in their small, often chaotic world. She quickly learned the landscape of her classroom, the boisterous sons of the blacksmith, the shy daughter of the mercantile owner, and the silent, watchful boy who belonged to the man with the honest eyes. Jonah Harding was a puzzle. He did not speak in class, not even to ask a question. When the other children's voices rose in a clamor of recitation or play, he would subtly flinch, his small shoulders tightening as if bracing for a physical blow. He did his work meticulously, his letters drawn with a slow, careful hand. He seemed to exist inside a bubble of quiet, a space no one could penetrate. No one, that is, except for a scruffy brown dog named Buck, who waited faithfully under the cottonwood tree outside. And, to Ada's surprise, the sound of her own voice, when she was not speaking, but humming. She discovered it by accident one afternoon while helping a young girl with her sums. A simple folk tune, one her mother used to sing, came to her lips without thought. When she glanced up, she saw Jonah had stopped his work. He was not looking at her, but at the window, his head tilted slightly. The tension was gone from his shoulders. He was simply listening. From then on, she made a point of humming, of singing softly as she moved through the room. It was a thread of sound she cast out, and while he never acknowledged it, she knew he held the other end. Most days, Cole Harding was waiting when the school door opened, but one afternoon, he was not there. The other children were collected one by one until only Jonah remained. Sitting on the school steps, Buck's head resting on his knee, Ada came out and sat beside him. She did not press him with questions. Instead, she took out a worn book of fables and began to read aloud. her voice a low, steady murmur against the whisper of the wind in the trees. Nearly an hour passed before Cole's wagon rumbled into view. He pulled the horses to a halt and swung down, his face grim with apology. There was a fresh gash on his forearm and a smear of grease on his cheek. He explained that the shaft on his windmill had seized. He had spent the afternoon wrestling with it. Ada looked from his exhausted face to his capable, grease-stained hands. She suggested gently that perhaps he could have sent someone for the boy. Cole shook his head, his gaze direct and unwavering. It was the same look he had given her at the market, honest and without artifice. He told her that out here. Anything worth doing, you had to do with your own 2 hands. There was no judgment in his tone, only a simple statement of fact, the core principle of his life. He thanked her for waiting, lifted Jonah into the wagon, and with a quiet word to his horses, was gone. Ada watched them go, the simple, profound statement echoing in her mind. It was a creed at odds with the easy promises of men like Silas Vane. Her interactions with the town's other influential men were of a different sort entirely. A few days later, Edwin Pike, the banker, intercepted her on her way back from the mercantile. He was impeccably dressed, his smile as polished as his boots. He spoke of his admiration for her work, for the civilizing influence she was bringing to Sagebrush Crossing. Then, with a flourish, he presented her with a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, resting on a bed of satin, was a silver hairpin. The head of it was a cluster of small, glittering stones. He called them diamonds, a token of his esteem. He said they would look beautiful in her hair at the harvest dance he was organizing. The invitation was smooth, confident, an assumption of her acceptance. Ada looked at the stones. They caught the light with a sharp, cold fire, but they had no depth, no warmth. They were industrial stones, perfectly formed and utterly without soul. She closed the box and handed it back to him. She thanked him for his generosity but declined both the gift and the invitation, explaining that her duties with the school required all of her attention. His smile tightened for a fraction of a second, the briefest flicker of surprise and annoyance. Before his polished composure returned, he expressed his regrets and tipped his hat, but as he walked away, Ada felt his calculating gaze on her back. She was a piece on his chessboard, and she had just made an unexpected move. Silas Vane's approach was less direct but far more insidious. He threw a grand town barbecue, with whole pigs roasting on spits and barrels of cider for everyone. It was a performance of generosity, and the whole town turned out for it, under a banner proclaiming progress and prosperity. Silas took to a makeshift stage. He spoke of the bright future the railroad would bring, and then he announced his latest philanthropic gesture. He was establishing a school fund, a magnificent sum of money to purchase new books, a proper stove for the winter, and even an organ for music lessons. A wave of applause and excited chatter went through the crowd. Parents looked at Ada, their faces alight with possibility. Then came the condition. Silas Vane announced this fund would be made available the very day the Union Meridian Company approved the route through the South Valley. He had tied the children's future directly to Cole Harding's ruin. Ada felt a cold fury rise within her. It was a masterful, cruel stroke of public manipulation. She saw Cole standing near his wagon, his face a stony mask. He had brought Jonah to the edge of the festivities, but they did not partake. They stood apart, watching the town celebrate a bargain made at their expense. The parents who had praised her work now looked at her with a new, questioning intensity. They did not know she had any say in the matter, but Silas's pronouncement had placed her, as the school teacher, squarely in the center of the conflict. The school was now a weapon, and he was aiming it at the heart of the valley. That night, the 10-day deadline from the telegraph felt more like a sentence than a timeline. Ada worked by the light of her lamp, her official surveyor's notes spread before her. She wrote with a clear, dispassionate hand, detailing the facts as her contract demanded. Route A South Valley, flat terrain. Minimal grading required. Crosses 6 private land holdings. Estimated construction time 5 months. Estimated cost $80,000. Route B, Red Willow Pass. Mountainous terrain. Requires extensive blasting and 3 trestle bridges. Crosses no private land holdings. Estimated construction time 9 months. Estimated cost $140,000. The numbers were stark. They made a powerful case for Silas Vane's preferred route. But numbers did not tell the whole story. They did not speak of a man's sweat equity in his land, or of a silent boy who found peace only in the familiar quiet of his home. They did not account for the soul of a community. Ada knew Cole was learning to let Jonah find his own footing, to trust that the boy could face the world. But this was not the world. This was a force of nature in a suit, a man who would grind them under the heel of progress without a second thought. Her own internal conflict was a raging storm. Her duty was to the company's bottom line. Her heart was with the man who fixed his own windmill. Her survey required a thorough review of all existing land claims in the affected area. The town registrar, a fussy little man overwhelmed by the sudden importance of his dusty records, had grudgingly provided her with copies. She was examining Silas Vane's large, consolidated parcel that bordered the southern edge of Cole's property when she noticed it. It was a tiny inconsistency, an area on the map where the ink seemed just a fraction darker, the line of a creek just a little too perfect. Most would have overlooked it, but Ada had been trained to see the small details. She pulled her lamp closer and took out a small magnifying glass, a tool she used for examining geological survey markings. Under the lens, the truth became clear. A faint, almost invisible line was still visible beneath the newer, darker one. The original boundary of Vane's property had been drawn 10 yards south of the creek. The new line, the official line on record, ran along the north bank. Someone had altered the map. It was a subtle, brilliant act of theft. The change gave Silas Vane exclusive control over the headwaters of the stream that irrigated the entire lower valley, including Cole Harding's ranch. He was not just trying to clear a path for a railroad. He was orchestrating a slow, deliberate strangulation of his neighbors, positioning himself to control the one resource more precious than silver or gold water. This was why the other ranchers had sold so readily. He had likely been bleeding their wells dry for a year. The hairpin with its false diamonds seemed like a child's toy compared to this. This was grand larceny disguised as a clerical correction. The glitter of Silas's public promises was a distraction from the quiet, methodical crime he was committing in the shadows. Ada leaned back in her chair, the cold of the room seeping into her bones. She now had proof of Silas Vane's corruption, but what could she do to reveal it would be to declare open war on the most powerful man in town, a man who had the bank and likely the sheriff in his pocket. It would mean stepping far beyond her role as a teacher and surveyor. It would mean choosing a side, not just in her report, but in the life of this town. She thought of Jonah, of the way he listened to her singing, a small boy searching for a safe harbor in a world that had become too loud and frightening. The courage of children, she mused, was not in speaking out, but in the simple, profound act of trusting. She had a choice. She could file her report based only on the cold, hard numbers, or she could honor that silent trust. She could listen to the voice of the vulnerable, a voice as quiet and as true as a speck of dust catching the lamplight, revealing the poisons in the air. The wind changed. For days it had been a cool, dry whisper from the mountains, but that afternoon it turned hot and thirsty, a restless breath that sucked the last of the moisture from the cured prairie grass. The sky, once a crisp and endless blue, took on a hazy, yellowed tint at the northern horizon. In the schoolhouse, Ada Merrick noticed the change first not with her eyes, but with her nose, a faint, acrid smell, like a distant memory of a fireplace, worked its way through the chinks in the window frames. She was in the middle of a geography lesson, pointing to a map of the United States, a colorful promise of a vast, connected nation. The children, however, were growing restless. They fidgeted, their attention drifting toward the windows, their senses picking up the same primal signals that had already sent a flock of geese rising in panicked unison from a nearby creek bed. Then came the visual proof. A column of dark gray smoke, thick and ugly, began to rise in the north, smudging the clean line of the horizon. It was miles away, but the hot wind was pushing it toward them with a terrifying speed. Ada's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She had read about prairie fires, had heard the stories of their devastating, unstoppable hunger. Her first instinct was a bolt of pure, cold fear. Her second, honed by the responsibility she now carried, was to protect her charges. She walked calmly to the door and looked out. Men were shouting in the distance. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer had been replaced by the frantic ringing of the town bell. Wagons were being hitched, and men on horseback were galloping north, their face set in grim lines. She turned back to the 20 pairs of wide, frightened eyes fixed upon her. She offered them a smile she hoped was reassuring. She told them they would finish their lesson inside, where it was safe. Her voice was even, a small anchor of calm in their rising sea of fear. She closed the heavy wooden shutters over the windows, plunging the room into a dim, dusty twilight. She lit a single lamp on her desk, creating a small, flickering circle of safety. Outside, Cole Harding was already moving. He had seen the smoke from his fields and had not wasted a second. He burst into his cabin, grabbed a shovel and a heavy burlap sack, and then paused, his gaze falling on Jonah. The boy was standing by the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, his face pale. Cole's heart twisted. He could not take him, and he could not leave him. Then he remembered the schoolhouse, the one solid, dependable building between his ranch and the fire. He made a split-second decision. He swung Jonah up onto his horse, galloped the short distance to the school, and deposited his son on the steps just as Ada was closing the door. Their eyes met for a brief, charged moment over the boy's head. No words were necessary. His gaze was a plea and a trust. Hers was a silent promise. He nodded once, a sharp, grateful gesture, and then wheeled his horse around, digging his heels in and racing to join the line of men heading toward the smoke. Ada brought Jonah inside. Seating him near her desk, she began to tell a story, her voice weaving a tale of a clever fox and a foolish bear, a simple narrative to hold the greater, more frightening story at bay. The younger children huddled closer, their fear soothed by the rhythm of her words. The fight at the fire line was a brutal, desperate affair. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking blanket. Cole worked alongside his neighbors, men he had known his whole life. All resentments and rivalries were burned away, leaving only a shared, desperate purpose. They used plows to carve long, dark furrows in the earth, creating a fire break, a line in the sand they prayed the flames would not cross. The dry soil was hard, and the work was backbreaking. Cole's hands, already calloused, were soon raw and blistering. He ignored the pain, his focus narrowed to the task, his movements becoming a grim, mechanical rhythm of dig, lift, and throw. He worked with a fierce, protective energy, the image of his son's small, pale face branded in his mind. Despite their efforts, the wind was too strong. Embers, carried on the hot gusts, leaped across their carefully plowed line, igniting new pockets of fire behind them. The line had not held. The fire was coming for the town. Inside the schoolhouse, the smell of smoke was now thick and suffocating. The air grew hotter. Ada knew they could not stay. She remembered a feature of the landscape she had noted in her surveying, something the children had shown her during a nature walk, an old, deep irrigation ditch, dug by the town's founders decades ago, ran from the hills behind the school all the way to the river. It was mostly dry now, a long, forgotten scar on the land, but it was deep enough to offer shelter. She stood up and clapped her hands, her sharp command cutting through the children's whimpers. She told them they were going on an adventure, a march to the river. She lined them up, the oldest holding hands with the youngest. She moved with a purpose that left no room for panic. Jonah stood by the door, his dog Buck whining at his side, his body trembling. He was frozen, his fear of the roaring noise outside paralyzing him. Ada knelt in front of him. She spoke his name softly. She told him she needed his help, that he had to be brave for the younger children. Then she held out her hand. For a long moment, he just stared at it. His gaze flickered from her face to his dog, his one constant companion. Then, slowly, his small, trembling fingers uncurled from the dog's fur and slipped into her palm. His hand was small and trusting, a silent surrender and a profound leap of faith. Holding his hand tightly, she led her small, soot-stained procession out the back door and into the terrifying, orange-brown world. They scrambled into the ditch, the old channel guiding them, a piece of the past offering salvation to the present. They made their way toward the life-giving water of the river, their small figures dwarfed by the smoke and fury that consumed the prairie behind them. By nightfall, the wind had mercifully shifted. A brief, unseasonable shower helped the ranchers finally contain the blaze, leaving behind a vast, blackened landscape that steamed and smoked under the rising moon. The town was saved, though several outlying barns and a winter's supply of hay had been lost. The schoolhouse became a makeshift infirmary and gathering place. The women of the town brought coffee, bread, and blankets. Ada, having seen all the children safely return to their parents, stayed to help. It was in this exhausted, subdued atmosphere that Silas Vane made his appearance. He was clean, his suit unwrinkled, his face a mask of civic concern. He moved among the weary ranchers, offering condolences and praise for their bravery. Then he gathered them together. He spoke of the tragedy, the terrible risk they all lived with. He laid the blame not on a stray bolt of lightning, but on what he called antiquated farming methods and a lack of proper, modern safety measures. A railroad, he argued, would have brought in the resources to build wider, more effective fire breaks. A railroad, he proclaimed, was not just about prosperity. It was about security. He was using their disaster as a closing argument, exploiting their exhaustion to sell his vision. Ada watched him, a bitter taste in her mouth. He had not lifted a shovel, yet he was reaping a political harvest from the ashes. Later, as the crowd thinned, she saw Cole sitting alone on a bench, staring into a cup of coffee. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes red from smoke and fatigue. His hands rested on his knees, raw and blistered. Ada went to the small medical kit the doctor had left and returned with a bowl of clean water and a roll of bandages. She knelt before him without a word and gently took one of his hands. He started to pull back, a reflexive gesture of pride, but then he relaxed and let her work. She carefully cleaned the grime from his raw skin and began to wrap the wounds in clean linen. The simple, quiet act was more intimate than any conversation. In the soft lamplight, she could see the profound weariness in his face, but underneath it was an unshakable strength. She was tending to the hands that had fought for his home, for his son, for his neighbors. These were the hands that fixed windmills and plowed the unyielding earth. As she finished the second hand, a small figure appeared at Cole's side. Jonah stood there, leaning his head against his father's arm. He looked at Ada, his eyes dark and serious in the dim light. Then, in a voice so soft it was barely more than a breath, he whispered, "Don't you go anywhere." The words hung in the air, a fragile, precious offering. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She saw Cole's jaw tighten. He heard, she knew he heard, but he did not look at her or his son. He kept his gaze fixed on his newly bandaged hands, as if the white linen was the most fascinating thing in the world. He was a man unaccustomed to accepting help, and even less accustomed to the terrifying vulnerability of hope. Ada finished her work and stood up, her heart aching with a tenderness that was both new and overwhelming. The fire had tested them all. It had revealed Cole's quiet, resolute heroism. and it had forged a new, unspoken bond between the three of them. Her internal debate over the railroad route was over. The numbers in her report could not capture the truth she had seen in the firelight, the truth of a community's courage and a father's resilience. To betray that for the sake of a cheaper route felt like the deepest kind of falsehood. That night, back in her room at the boarding house, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose she had not felt since her arrival. The path was difficult, but it was clear. She would recommend the Red Willow Pass route. As she was about to extinguish her lamp, she saw a piece of folded paper on the floor, slipped under her door. It had not been there before. Her brow furrowed as she picked it up. The paper was rough, the handwriting a crude, heavy scrawl. There was no signature. There were only 9 words. Choose the right route, and you will be safe. The warmth and clarity of a moment ago vanished, replaced by an icy dread. The message was not a suggestion. It was a threat. The fire on the prairie had been extinguished, but a new, more personal fire had just been lit. The church bell in Sagebrush Crossing did not ring for salvation that day. It rang for a reckoning. Its solemn, metallic toll rolled across the blackened prairie, a summons for the town to gather and bear witness. The sound was a heavy weight in the air, pulling people from their homes and ranches, their faces etched with a mixture of hope, fear, and hungry curiosity. The town hall, which also served as a church on Sundays, was packed. The pews filled with farmers in their clean, worn shirts and women in their best calico dresses. The air was thick with the scent of pine floorboards, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of a community on the brink of a monumental decision. Ada Merrick sat near the back, the anonymous threat tucked away in her reticule, a cold, hard secret against her thigh. She watched as the town council, a trio of grim-faced merchants, took their seats behind a long table at the front. Sheriff Pike stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression carefully neutral. He was a human weather vane, and Ada could see he was waiting to see which way the wind of power would blow. Silas Vane sat at a table to the right, flanked by his lawyer. He looked completely at ease, a spider in the center of a newly spun web. Opposite him, alone, sat Cole Harding. He was not wearing his work clothes, but a simple, dark coat that made his bandaged hands seem stark and white. He did not look at the council or at Silas. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, a silent, solitary island in a sea of murmuring voices. The hearing began. Silas Vane spoke first. His voice was a smooth, reasonable balm, intended to soothe any lingering anxieties. He spoke of the fire, praising the town's courage while subtly reminding them of their vulnerability. He painted a future made safe and prosperous by the railroad, a future where their children would have opportunities beyond the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. It was a masterful performance. Then came the legal maneuvering. He announced that the question of the route was, in fact, already largely decided by the will of the people. He produced a leather portfolio and, with a theatrical flourish, began to lay out a series of land deeds on the council's table. He named the names of the ranchers who had, he claimed, voluntarily and eagerly sold their land to his development company to make way for the tracks. He called them patriots of progress. A low murmur went through the crowd as the names were read. These were families who had been struggling, men who had been squeezed by the drought and the early frost. Ada watched their faces in the crowd. They would not meet Cole's eyes. They looked down at their hands, their expressions a mixture of shame and defiance. One of the deeds was passed to a councilman, who then handed it to another. As it made its way down the line, it slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor near Ada's feet. She bent to pick it up. The paper was thick and official, filled with dense legal script. But it was not the text that caught her eye. It was the corner. The top right corner of the page had been folded over at some point, creating a sharp, distinctive crease. In the very tip of that broken corner was a tiny, almost imperceptible smudge of ink, a ghost of a line that did not belong. Her breath caught. It was the same pattern, the same telltale sign of erasure she had discovered on Silas Vane's altered property map. The smudge was the remnant of the original survey line, the one that proved his theft of the valley's water. This deed was not just a land transfer, it was fruit from a poisoned tree. He had not just bought their land, he had coerced them, using his control of the water to make their farms untenable. He had manufactured their consent. Before she could process the thought, Sheriff Pike cleared his throat and declared a short recess. The room erupted in conversation. Ada saw Edwin Pike, the banker, make his way smoothly through the crowd toward Cole. She watched as Edwin placed a friendly hand on Cole's shoulder, his expression one of deep concern. He spoke in a low voice, but Ada was close enough to see the hard gleam in the banker's eyes. He was talking about Cole's loan, about the upcoming payment. He was offering an extension, but the offer was a velvet glove on an iron fist. Ada knew, with a sickening certainty, that the interest rate would be crippling, another link in the chain being forged around Cole's property. Cole listened, his face impassive. When Edwin was finished, Cole simply shook his head. A single, resolute motion. He would not sell, and he would not be yoked by predatory debt. He would stand on his own 2 feet, even if the ground beneath them was crumbling. Edwin's smile faltered, and he walked away, the friendly mask replaced by a look of cold calculation. Ada knew she could not remain silent. The folded corner of the deed in her memory was a call to action. When the hearing reconvened, she stood. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the schoolteacher. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, though her heart was pounding. She addressed the council. She asked if the deeds had been properly verified. She asked if any consideration had been given to the pre-existing water rights associated with those properties. She was careful, her questions precise, hinting at a legal complexity they had overlooked. Silas Vane chuckled, a sound of condescending amusement. He stood and looked at Ada as if she were a curious child. He asked the council and the entire room, what a schoolteacher from the East, a woman who had never faced a Wyoming blizzard or a season of drought, could possibly know about the hard choices required to build a community in this unforgiving land. The jab landed. She saw a few men nod in agreement. She was an outsider, meddling in things she did not understand. Sheriff Pike stepped forward, his voice a dull, final thud. He said that the deeds were legally filed and notarized. The law is the law, he declared, and that was the end of it. The council members nodded sagely, relieved to have their course of action so clearly affirmed. Ada sat down, her face burning. She had spoken the truth, but they had wrapped themselves in the law, refusing to see that the law itself had been twisted into a weapon. That evening, the cold wind felt like a personal rebuke. Ada rode a borrowed horse out to Cole's ranch. She found him in the barn, mending a piece of harness by lantern light. Jonah was asleep in a small cot in the corner. Buck curled up on the floor beside him. She told him what she suspected about the deeds, about the altered map and the water rights. He listened without surprise, his face grim. He had known, in his bones, that Vane was a cheat. Seeing it laid out so clearly only confirmed the depth of the man's corruption. Ada, driven by her fear for him and for Jonah, found herself pleading a case she did not believe in. She urged him to be careful, to be more diplomatic. She suggested he should bend a little, to find some way to compromise with Vane, to protect his son from the fight to come. Cole stopped his work. He set the leather strap and the awl down with deliberate care. He turned to her, and the weary frustration in his eyes was so profound it made her fall silent. His voice was low, rough with an emotion he rarely showed. He asked her if bending meant selling his dignity piece by piece. He looked over at his sleeping son. He could lose a season's crop. He told her, his voice cracking slightly. He could lose this whole ranch, but he could not, would not, lose his self-respect in front of his son. He said that was all a man really had to leave his boy that was worth a damn. The words struck Ada with the force of a physical blow. She finally understood. This was not the stubborn pride of a foolish man. It was the fierce, protective honor of a father. It was the bedrock of his soul, the one thing that could not be bought or sold or legislated away. In his world, a man's character was his only true deed to his place in the world. He was not just fighting for his land. He was fighting for the right to teach his son what it meant to be an honest man. She left his ranch that night with a heavy heart, but a clear mind. Her path was no longer a choice between two routes on a map. It was a choice between two ways of life. Back in her room, the anonymous threat seemed less frightening and more pathetic. It was the tool of a coward. She sat at her desk, the company's official documents spread before her. She needed a new strategy, a weapon that Silas Vane and the town council could not ignore. She picked up a copy of the letter Vane had circulated a week ago, the one that supposedly contained a preliminary approval for the valley route from the Union Meridian Railroad. He had used it to convince people that the decision was a foregone conclusion. At the time, she had assumed it was some sort of procedural document. Now, she looked at it with new eyes. On a whim, she pulled out her own confidential letter of authorization, the one that gave her the power of a surveyor. Both letters bore the official seal of the company, a proud eagle perched atop a railroad spike. She held them side by side under the lamplight. At first glance, they were identical, but Ada's eyes, trained to notice the smallest detail, saw the flaw. She brought the lamp closer. On her official letter, the eagle's left wing had 3 distinct feather layers. On Silas Vane's letter, it only had 2. The lettering of the company motto, Progress and Union, was slightly thicker on his version. It was a forgery. A brilliant, almost perfect forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. Silas Vane had not just been intimidating farmers and altering local maps. He had committed a federal crime. He had forged the seal of one of the most powerful corporations in America. A slow, cold smile touched Ada's lips. The church bell had called for a judgment, and the town had rendered its verdict. But they had been listening to the wrong evidence. "The law is the law," the sheriff had said. And Silas Vane had just broken a law far bigger than any of them could imagine. The forged seal was a key, but a key was useless without a lock to turn. Ada knew she needed more than a suspicion. She needed indisputable proof that the Red Willow Pass route was not just an alternative, but a viable one. The numbers in her report told one story, but the land itself held the final word. She sent a carefully worded telegraph to her superiors in Omaha. Reporting a significant legal discrepancy, she chose the word carefully with the proposed valley route and formally requesting a company-sanctioned survey team to assist in a final assessment of the pass. 2 days later, 2 men arrived on the train. They were professional surveyors, all hard lines and leather measuring cases, men who spoke in the clipped, precise language of elevations and gradients. They were not here to question her authority, but to verify her findings. Their presence gave her the official cover she needed. She approached Cole the evening before the expedition. She found him reinforcing a fence line, the rhythmic thud of his post driver echoing in the crisp air. She explained the situation, that she needed a guide, someone who knew the mountains better than any map. She did not mention the forgery or the threat. She simply framed it as a necessary step to ensure a fair decision. Cole listened, his eyes on the distant, jagged peaks of the Red Willow Range. He knew those mountains. He had hunted them as a boy and knew their moods, their dangers, and their secrets. He looked from the mountains to Ada, and then his gaze drifted toward the small cabin where Jonah was playing on the porch. He could not leave the boy. There was no one he could ask, no one he trusted enough. Ada saw the conflict in his face. Without thinking, she said that Jonah could come. She argued that the survey was only a day trip, up to the summit and back before dusk. She promised she would watch him. It was a risk, she knew, but the thought of leaving him behind, of separating this small, fragile family, even for a day, felt wrong. Cole studied her face for a long time, his expression unreadable. He was weighing the danger of the mountain against this new, unsettling feeling of trust. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. They set out at dawn, a small party against a vast landscape. The two company surveyors rode ahead, their pack mules laden with equipment. Ada rode beside Cole, who had Jonah seated in front of him on the saddle, the boy's small frame wrapped in a thick blanket. Buck, the dog, trotted faithfully alongside them. The air was cold and sharp, and their breath plumed in white clouds. The ascent was slow and arduous. The trail, little more than a game path, wound its way through dense stands of pine and aspen, their golden leaves a stark contrast against the dark rock. Cole led them with an unerring sense of direction, pointing out rockfalls and animal tracks, reading the land like a familiar book. Ada watched him, a quiet admiration growing within her. This was his world, and in it, he moved with a confidence and grace she had never seen in the tense confines of the town. By midday, they had reached a high meadow just below the pass itself. The view was breathtaking. The entire valley spread out below them, a patchwork of gold and brown, the town a tiny, insignificant cluster of buildings in the distance. The surveyors immediately set to work, unlimbering their transit and driving stakes, their voices a low murmur of numbers and angles. Jonah, who had been silent and watchful all morning, seemed to come alive in the high, clear air. He and Buck chased grasshoppers in the meadow while Ada and Cole watched. For a little while, the weight of their respective burdens seemed to lift. They were simply a man and a woman watching a child play, a small, peaceful tableau under the immense Wyoming sky. But the sky was changing. The crisp blue of the morning was being consumed by a bruised, gray bank of clouds moving in from the northwest with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, its playful whisper turning into a mournful howl. Cole stopped watching his son and stood, his face turned to the wind, his eyes narrowed. He had seen skies like this before. He told them they had to go, now. The surveyors, engrossed in their work, argued for another hour. Cole's response was blunt. The mountain did not care about their measurements. A blizzard was coming. His words were prophetic. Within minutes, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a winter morning, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a furious wind. The temperature plummeted. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The trail they had followed up the mountain vanished. They were trapped. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at Ada. But Cole was a whirlwind of calm. Decisive action. He led them to a small, sheltered copse of pines, their thick boughs offering a slight reprieve from the wind. He unstrapped the small emergency tent from his pack mule. As he and the surveyors struggled to raise it in the gale, a powerful gust tore a toolbox from a mule's pack, sending it tumbling into a deep, snow-filled ravine. Their shovels and axe were gone. The tent was up, but it was not enough. The wind was a solid wall, threatening to rip the canvas from its moorings. They needed a windbreak. Without a word, Cole knelt at the edge of the tent and began to dig into the rapidly deepening snow with his hands. His bandaged hands. Ada cried out for him to stop, but he did not seem to hear her. He worked with a desperate, focused energy, clawing at the frozen earth and snow, piling it up to form a low wall. The other men, shamed into action by his raw determination, joined him, but it was his effort, his raw, physical will, that created their shelter. Finally, the windbreak was done. They huddled inside the small tent, the canvas shuddering and groaning around them. The cold was a living thing, a predator seeking to leech the warmth from their bodies. They managed to get a small, sputtering fire going in a makeshift fire pit near the tent's opening, its meager heat a small defiance against the storm. The two surveyors, their professional detachment shattered, wrapped themselves in their bedrolls and fell into a grim, exhausted silence. Cole sat by the opening, feeding scraps of wood into the fire, his face a stoic mask in the flickering light. His hands, unwrapped, were raw and bleeding again. Ada gathered Jonah close, tucking the blanket tightly around him. The boy was trembling, not from the cold, but from the terrifying, relentless sound of the wind. Ada began to speak, her voice a low, soft murmur. She did not tell a story of foxes or bears. She told him about the letters of the alphabet. She gave each letter a personality. A was an adventurer, climbing mountains. B was a baker, making warm bread. She traced the letters on his palm, her own breath a visible ghost in the frigid air. It was a fragile shield of words against the storm's fury, a tiny spark of order in the heart of chaos. Jonah's trembling slowly subsided. He leaned against her, his breathing evening out. Cole watched them from across the small fire, his eyes dark with an emotion Ada could not name. In that small, freezing tent, besieged by the elements, they were no longer a schoolteacher, a rancher, and his son. They were a temporary family, a tiny unit of warmth and life huddled together against the vast, indifferent cold. A profound and unspoken tenderness bloomed in the frozen air between them. The storm raged through the night and into the next day. By the time it finally broke, they were exhausted, hungry, and half frozen. But they were alive. The world outside the tent was a landscape of stunning, brutal beauty, transformed by a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The journey down the mountain was even more perilous than the ascent. They had to navigate deep drifts and treacherous patches of ice. At one point, they came to a steep, ice-slicked ledge. Jonah, his small boots unable to find purchase, froze, his fear returning. Cole started to move toward him, but Ada, who was closer, put a hand on his arm. She whispered for Cole to let her. Cole hesitated, the instinct to protect his son warring with the trust he had seen forged in the tent. He nodded, his jaw tight. Ada knelt and held her hands out to Jonah. She did not pull or cajole. She just waited, her gaze steady and reassuring. After a long moment, Jonah reached out and placed his hands in hers. She guided him, step by careful step, across the ice, her presence a silent promise of safety. Cole watched, a hard knot in his chest loosening. He was learning, in the harshest of classrooms, that sometimes protecting someone meant letting another person help. As they neared the valley floor, they saw it, a great dark river of life flowing through the snow-covered landscape. A herd of buffalo, hundreds strong, was moving through the pass, following an ancient, instinctual route. They were a testament to the mountain's enduring vitality, a powerful, living sign from the natural world. The pass was difficult. It was dangerous, but it was passable. It was alive. Seeing the herd, Ada felt a final, unshakable resolve settle in her soul. She would recommend the Red Willow Pass. She would face Silas Vane's fury, her company's displeasure, and the town's disappointment. It was the right thing to do. The land itself had told her so. That evening, a message was delivered to her room at the boarding house. It was from Edwin Pike, requesting her presence at the bank for a matter of some urgency. Wary but curious, she went. She found him waiting in his opulent office, a fire crackling in the hearth, a stark contrast to the desperate fire in the tent. He was all smooth charm and solicitous concern. He told her he had heard of her ordeal, that he admired her courage. He spoke of the town's future and of his desire to see it led by people of vision and integrity, people like her. Then he walked to his desk and picked up a small, velvet box. He opened it. Inside, on a bed of black silk, lay a ring. A large, impeccably cut diamond sat in its center, flashing with a brilliant, multifaceted light. It was a real diamond, a stone of immense value and cold, hard beauty. He got down on one knee. He asked her to be his wife. Ada stared at him, stunned into silence. He took her silence for consideration and pressed his case. He told her he could give her a life of comfort and security. He said that together, they could guide this town. And then came the final, chilling piece of his proposal. He told her he knew about Silas Vane's methods, about the pressure he was putting on people. He said that as her husband, he would use the full power of his bank to financially ruin Silas, to drive him from the valley. He would stop him, completely and forever. He would do all of this for her. All she had to do, he said, his voice a soft, persuasive whisper, was agree to marry him and tear up her report on the Red Willow Pass. The town hall was transformed. Gone were the hardback pews and the solemn air of legal hearings. In their place were long tables laden with food, pine boughs draped over the rafters, and the cheerful, slightly off-key sound of a fiddle and a piano sawing their way through a popular reel. The harvest dance was the one night of the year when Sagebrush Crossing allowed itself to forget the harsh realities of its existence. It was a night of forced gaiety, a collective prayer for a mild winter and a prosperous spring. Ada Merrick, however, could not forget. Edwin Pike's proposal hung in the air between them, an unspoken and menacing contract. When she had left his office, she had given him no answer, only a polite but firm request for time to consider his extraordinary offer. She knew, and he knew, that tonight was her deadline. She walked into the hall, feeling as though she were stepping onto a stage, the lead actress in a play whose final act had not yet been written. Every head turned as she entered. She wore a simple dark blue dress, the best she owned, but she felt as plain and unadorned as a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. Edwin was immediately at her side, his hand possessively on her elbow. He was the picture of success, his smile broad, his confidence radiating like heat from a stove. He guided her through the crowd, every one of his movements a declaration of ownership. Silas Vane watched them from across the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw the tension in Ada's shoulders, the way she held herself aloof from Edwin's touch. He raised his glass to her in a silent, mocking toast. He believed he still held the winning hand. The music swirled, the dancers stomped, and the laughter rose to the rafters, but it was all a thin veneer over the current of raw anxiety that ran through the room. Every person there knew that more than just the harvest was being celebrated. They were dancing on the fault line of their own future, and the schoolteacher was the one who would decide which way the ground would shift. Just as the fiddler was about to start a new tune, Silas Vane held up a hand. The music faltered and died. He walked to the center of the room, his voice easily commanding the sudden silence. He thanked them all for coming, his tone dripping with a false sincerity that made Ada's skin crawl. He spoke of their shared destiny, of the bright future that was within their grasp. Then came the theater. He clapped his hands, and one of his men brought forward a large, flat silver tray. On it, sparkling under the lantern light like 1,000 captured stars, was a glittering pile of stones. They were not gems of any real quality, Ada knew, but to the work-weary eyes of the ranchers and their wives, they looked like a king's ransom. Silas declared that these were for the schoolteacher, a token of the town's gratitude, to be presented to her the moment she endorsed the only sensible route for the railroad, the one that would bring them all such wealth. It was a public bribe, audacious and brilliant in its simplicity. He was not just trying to buy her. He was using the town's own desires as a weapon against her. But he was not finished. He clapped again. Another man came forward, this one carrying a thick, ribbon-tied stack of documents. Silas took them and held them aloft. He called them deeds. He explained that once the valley land was consolidated, he would grant these new, more prosperous parcels to the very people who stood in this room. He was offering them a trade their heritage for a promise, their independence for a piece of his empire. The room was utterly silent, every person caught in the hypnotic glare of the stones and the rustle of the papers. At that moment, Edwin Pike made his move. He saw his opportunity to upstage Silas, to present himself as the town's true savior, and to claim his prize once and for all. He let go of Ada's arm, took 2 steps into the center of the room, and knelt before her. The collective gasp of the crowd was a single, sharp intake of breath. He took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and from his waistcoat pocket, he produced the small velvet box. He opened it. The diamond in the ring was not like the stones on the tray. It was a single, magnificent stone, cut with a master's precision. It did not glitter. It burned. A cold, perfect fire that seemed to suck all the light and warmth from the room. He spoke her name, his voice resonating with rehearsed passion. He spoke of his vision for their future, a partnership that would lead Sagebrush Crossing into a new era. He asked her to be his wife. The silence that followed was absolute. Ada stood frozen, trapped in the crossfire of two men's ambitions. On one side was Silas, offering diamonds and deeds, a future built on corruption. On the other was Edwin, offering a different kind of bribe, a life of ease, a real diamond, and the cynical promise of justice, all in exchange for her silence and her submission. The entire town was her audience, their faces a mixture of awe, envy, and expectation. They were waiting for her to choose her price. She felt a wave of nausea, a desperate need to escape the suffocating heat and the pressure of 100 pairs of eyes. She gently pulled her hand from Edwin's grasp, murmuring that she needed a moment, that she needed some air. She turned and walked, her legs unsteady, toward the double doors that led out onto the porch. The cold night air was a shock, a blessed relief. She leaned against the railing, taking deep, shuddering breaths, the frantic music of the dance a dull throb behind her. She was not alone. In the shadows at the far end of the porch, a figure was standing. It was Cole Harding. He had not come inside. He was not a part of their celebration. He wore his worn work coat, and his hands, resting on the railing, were bare. The fresh scars from the fire a pale tracery in the moonlight. There was a smudge of mud on his cheek, as if he had come straight from some evening chore. He was not looking at her, but out at the dark, silent prairie. He must have heard the commotion from inside, must have seen Edwin on his knee. Yet, when he finally turned his head, his eyes held no question, no plea. There was only that unwavering, honest gaze she had come to know, an honesty that was as much a part of him as the lines etched on his face. He did not ask what she was going to do. He simply stated a fact, a truth he had settled in his own soul. He told her to do what was right. His voice was low and steady, a rock in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. He said he would teach Jonah how to bear the rest. In that single, selfless sentence, he gave her back her freedom. He was not asking her to save him. He was telling her that his son's character was more important than his own comfort, that integrity was a legacy worth preserving even in the face of ruin. He trusted her to make the right choice, and he trusted himself to endure the consequences, no matter what they were. A profound clarity washed over Ada. The conflict that had torn her apart for weeks was suddenly, blessedly simple. She knew what she had to do. She turned and walked back into the town hall, her steps now firm and certain. The crowd parted before her as if she were a ship's prow cutting through water. The music was still silent. Edwin was on his feet, his face a mask of anxious confidence. Silas watched her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Ada walked past them both, directly to the main table at the front of the room, from her reticule. She took the small, velvet-lined box Edwin had given her days before, the one containing the hairpin with its fake diamonds. She opened it and placed it deliberately on the table, a quiet, symbolic rejection of all false promises. Her gaze then swept over the tray of glittering stones and the thick stack of deeds. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, at the desperate hope and the hungry greed in their eyes. She saw the future these objects represented, a future of bitter rivalries, of broken trust, of a community that had sold its soul for a handful of shiny rocks. Then she turned her back on it all. She turned and faced the open doorway, to the dark porch where the lone figure was still standing. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent, Waiting room. It was as clear and as true as the ringing of a bell on a cold morning. She said that she chose the man with bare hands and an honest eye. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, only a stunned, uncomprehending silence. Then the room exploded. A single, whooping cheer went up from a corner, followed by a smattering of applause. But it was quickly drowned out by a roar of angry, confused voices. Men who had been promised land and wealth shouted in frustration. Silas Vane slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. Edwin Pike simply stood there, his face ashen, his humiliation complete and absolute. The town had not just been denied its prize, it had been judged, and it had been found wanting. Silas recovered first. His mind, always sharp, always predatory, saw a way to salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. If he could not discredit the decision, he would destroy the man she had chosen. He leaped onto the small stage, his voice cutting through the din like a whip crack. He pointed a shaking finger toward the porch. He yelled that they did not know who Cole Harding was. He spun a tale, a vicious and believable lie. He claimed that Harding was not just a simple farmer. He said that in the Montana Territory, where he had come from. He had been a regulator, a member of a violent band of vigilantes who had taken the law into their own hands. He painted a picture of a dangerous man, a man with a dark past, a man who had no respect for the law and order they were trying to build. A new, uglier murmur swept through the crowd. The anger and disappointment of a moment ago curdled into suspicion and fear. They looked from Silas's accusing finger to the quiet man on the porch, and they saw not a neighbor, but a threat. Sheriff Pike, his face beaded with sweat, saw the situation spiraling out of his control. A brawl was imminent. He pushed his way through the crowd. He did not look at Ada. He walked straight to the door, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He told Cole that he had to come with him. He said it was for everyone's safety, to keep the peace until things settled down. It was not an arrest. Not yet. It was a cauterizing of a wound, a swift and brutal act to restore order. Cole did not resist. He looked once at Ada. His eyes filled not with fear for himself, but with a deep and aching concern for her. Then he allowed the sheriff to lead him away into the darkness. Ada stood alone in the center of the hostile room, the sound of angry accusations ringing in her ears. She had made her choice. She had chosen the man with the bare hands and the honest eye. And in doing so, she had delivered him into the hands of his enemies. The chaos in the town hall did not subside. It curdled. The angry shouts congealed into a low, ugly muttering as Sheriff Pike led Cole away. Ada stood alone in the center of the room, the target of 100 hostile glares. She had not only defied their hopes for wealth, she had chosen a man they now believed to be a dangerous outlaw, in their eyes. Her judgment was not just flawed, it was a threat to their safety. She saw Jonah standing near the doorway, his small face a mask of confusion and terror, being sheltered by the sturdy presence of Mrs. Ruth Tabor. The baker gave Ada a small, almost imperceptible nod, a tiny signal of solidarity in a sea of animosity. It was enough. Ada straightened her shoulders, her fear solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. She had hours, perhaps only until morning, before Silas Vane could solidify his lie and turn the entire town into a mob. She left the hall, ignoring the insults and accusations that followed her like stones. Her first stop was the telegraph office. The young operator, a boy no older than 17, was still on duty, his face pale from the night's excitement. Ada placed her forged letter and her own official one side by side on his counter. She asked him if he remembered who had given him the forged letter to transmit the week before. The boy, intimidated by the intensity in her eyes, stammered that Mr. Vane's lawyer had brought it in. Ada then asked him to check his logbook. Every telegram, official or private, was recorded. The boy's finger ran down the page, and then he stopped. He confirmed it, a message, marked as a preliminary approval from the Union Meridian Railroad, had been sent on behalf of Silas Vane. Ada had her first piece of corroborating evidence. Her next stop was Ruth Tabor's bakery, The warm, yeasty air was a sanctuary from the town's cold fury. Mrs. Tabor had taken Jonah back to her own small apartment above the shop, and the boy was now asleep, exhausted by the trauma of the evening. Ruth, her kind face set in grim lines, listened as Ada explained her discovery of the forgery. The baker nodded slowly. She said she had always known Silas Vane was a snake, but she had never imagined the scope of his venom. Ada asked her if she recalled seeing the letter delivered. Ruth Tabor was the unofficial postmistress of Sagebrush Crossing. All important mail passed through her hands. Ruth went to a small, tidy desk in the corner and opened a heavy ledger. Her handwriting was a neat, precise script. She ran her finger down a column. "Here it is," she said, her voice quiet with satisfaction. "Received one official-looking envelope from Mr. Vane, addressed to the town council. I noted it because the wax seal seemed too perfect, like it was made in a factory, not an office." She offered to testify, to bring her ledger as proof. Ada now had a witness, a respected member of the community who could attest to the letter's origin. The truth was a sword, but she still needed a way to wield it. As she left the bakery, a plan began to form in her mind. A desperate gamble that depended on the character of a man she barely knew, Sheriff Pike. The sheriff was holding Cole not in the town's single, flimsy jail cell, but in his own small office. It was a measure of his uncertainty. He was containing a threat, but he was not yet ready to condemn a man. Ada found him sitting behind his desk, staring at a map on the wall, his face a study in weary frustration. Ada laid her evidence on his desk, the two letters, side by side. She pointed out the subtle, damning differences in the forged seal. She told him about the telegraph operator and Mrs. Tabor. She explained her theory about the altered property maps and the stolen water rights. She spoke quickly, her voice low and urgent, laying out a pattern of calculated, criminal fraud. The sheriff listened, his expression slowly changing from weary skepticism to a dawning, angry realization. He had allowed himself to be a pawn, a tool of convenience for a wealthy man. The law he had so staunchly defended had been a sham. He was a proud man, and the knowledge that he had been so thoroughly duped was a bitter pill. He stood, his decision made. He told Ada he was riding Cole out to the Harding Ranch at first light to verify his story about the altered creek bed. If it was true, he would call an immediate emergency council meeting. Just before dawn, a strange, ominous stillness fell over the land. The wind died completely. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sky turned a sickly shade of yellow-brown. A sandstorm was brewing. Despite the threatening weather, the sheriff was a man of his word. He brought Cole out, his hands unbound, and they mounted their horses. Ada, refusing to be left behind, rode with them. They were halfway to the ranch when the storm hit. It came upon them with the fury of an ocean squall. A solid, roaring wall of sand and wind that reduced the world to a blinding, choking chaos. The horses whinnied in terror, turning their backs to the onslaught. They were forced to dismount and huddle behind a small rock outcropping, the sand scouring their exposed skin. Through the maelstrom, Ada saw a movement. A lone rider, his face obscured by a bandana, was approaching them, a rifle held across his saddle. He was one of Silas Vane's men, a hired hand she had seen at the dance. He was not there to kill them. Ada realized with a jolt of terror, he was there to intimidate, to ensure Cole Harding never made it back to town to testify. The man raised his rifle, aiming it not at them, but into the air. He was going to fire a warning shot, a classic tactic of fear. But at that exact moment, his horse, spooked by the storm, reared violently. The man's shot went wild. Ada heard a sharp cry of pain. Sheriff Pike stumbled and fell to one knee, clutching his shoulder. A dark stain was already spreading across the fabric of his shirt. It was not a serious wound, a shallow graze, but the shock and pain were real. The rider, his face a mask of panic at his blunder, wheeled his horse around and disappeared back into the storm. Cole reacted instantly. He tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and pressed it hard against the sheriff's wound to stanch the bleeding. He spoke in a low, calming voice, his hands sure and steady. He assessed the wound with the practical knowledge of a man who had doctored his own animals, his movements efficient and gentle. He helped the groaning sheriff to his feet and, with his own body, shielded the older man from the worst of the wind. In that moment, all of Silas Vane's lies turned to dust and blew away in the storm. Here was not a violent regulator, but a man of instinctual decency and courage. He had just saved the life of the man who held him captive. The sheriff looked at Cole, his face pale with pain, and in his eyes was a look of profound, dawning respect. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world coated in a fine layer of brown dust, they made their way back to town. The emergency council meeting was not held in the tense confines of the hall, but outside, in the raw, scoured air, as if the storm had stripped away all pretense. The entire town gathered, their faces subdued, their earlier anger replaced by a quiet, waiting uncertainty. The sheriff, his arm in a sling, spoke first. He told them what had happened in the storm, his voice clear and unwavering. He publicly vouched for Cole Harding's character, formally clearing him of all suspicion. Then, he turned the meeting over to Ada. Ada stood before them, no longer an outsider, but a voice of truth. She did not speak of forgeries or threats. Instead, she unrolled the surveyor's map of the Red Willow Pass. She presented her official recommendation, her voice ringing with a conviction born of surviving fire and ice. She laid out the surveyor's findings, the increased cost, yes, but also the long-term benefits of a route that did not destroy a valley. A route that served the entire community, not just one man's greed. She spoke of the buffalo herd, of a future that worked with the land, not against it. When she was finished, a vote was called. It was not a vote about a railroad. It was a vote about what kind of town they wanted to be. One by one, hands went up, not in the angry and grasping motion of the night before, but in a slow, deliberate gesture of assent. The Red Willow Pass route was approved. From the edge of the crowd, Silas Vane watched his empire crumble. He turned, a hunted look in his eyes, and began to walk quickly toward the bank, his one remaining source of power. But his path was blocked. Edwin Pike stood before him, his face no longer that of a polished opportunist, but of a man who had made a difficult choice. Two of the bank's clerks stood behind him, their expressions grim. Edwin told Silas that his accounts had been frozen. He had spent the morning reviewing Silas's financial records, the secret ledgers that detailed the fraudulent land deals and the coerced sales. He held up a thick, black book. He told Silas he had already sent a telegraph to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Silas lunged, but it was a desperate, futile gesture. He was finished, as the sheriff, his good arm firm, took Silas into custody. Edwin Pike walked over to Ada. He did not look at her, but at the ground, a flush of shame on his face. He told her that diamonds were beautiful, but a man's self-respect shone brighter. He then turned and walked back into his bank, a man who had lost a bride but had perhaps, in that moment, saved his own soul. The real true seal of justice, Ada thought, was not the one stamped by a company, but the one forged in the conscience of a community that had finally chosen to do the right thing. The autumn that followed was one of quiet mending. The wind that swept through the valley no longer carried the scent of smoke or the bitter dust of conflict, but the clean, sharp promise of snow and the sweet smell of curing hay. The decision made in the open air that day had settled over Sagebrush Crossing like a gentle rain, washing away the fever of greed and leaving behind the sober, steady work of building a community. The Union Meridian Railroad accepted Ada's recommendation. Their engineers, after reviewing the surveyor's data and Ada's detailed report on the legal entanglements of the valley route, concluded that the Red Willow Pass was the more secure, if more expensive, investment. Progress would come to the town, but it would arrive on a schedule dictated by the steady, patient rhythm of blasting rock and building trestles, not the frantic pace of speculation. The valley, with its small ranches and life-giving creek, was left untouched, a quiet testament to the town's hard-won wisdom. Silas Vane was taken to Cheyenne by a federal marshal to face charges of mail fraud, forgery, and land encroachment. His web of deceit, once so formidable, unraveled with astonishing speed. The hired hands and cronies he had employed vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only the bitter memory of their intimidation. The ranchers he had coerced, with Edwin Pike's legal assistance, began the slow process of reclaiming their water rights and renegotiating their land sales from a position of strength. The first Sunday after Silas's departure, Sheriff Pike stood before the town at the church service. His arm was still in a sling, a visible reminder of the violence that had nearly torn them apart. He spoke in a voice stripped of its usual bluster, a voice of quiet humility. He publicly thanked Cole Harding, not just for his aid during the sandstorm, but for his steadfastness in the face of immense pressure. He acknowledged his own errors in judgment, and in doing so, he gave the town permission to do the same. It was a moment of healing, a public restoration of honor that solidified Cole's place not as a solitary rancher, but as a respected pillar of the community he had fought so hard to protect. Life settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. Ada continued to teach, her small schoolhouse a haven of learning and quiet growth. She was no longer seen as an outsider, a meddler from the East. She was their teacher, the woman who had held fast to her principles and, in doing so, had helped them find their own. Cole worked his land, the rhythm of his chores a steady heartbeat in the quiet valley. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The unspoken barriers of pride and caution had been washed away, leaving a space of warm, easy companionship. He often found reasons to be in town near the end of the school day, and they would walk together, speaking of small things, the price of feed, a child's progress in reading, the changing colors of the aspen leaves. The culmination of this quiet healing came with the harvest blessing, an old tradition revived by Mrs. Tabor. It was not a boisterous dance like the one that had ended in chaos, but a simple, solemn gathering at the church to give thanks for the season's meager but sufficient bounty. The whole town was there, their faces illuminated by candlelight, a spirit of quiet gratitude filling the room. Ada and Cole stood together, a space naturally forming around them as if the town was wordlessly acknowledging their bond. Jonah stood between them. For weeks, the boy had been slowly emerging from his shell of silence. He had begun to answer questions in class, his voice soft but clear. He had even started to play with the other children, his laughter a new and wonderful sound in the schoolyard. During the final prayer, he reached out his small hands. One found Ada's, and the other found Cole's. He held on tightly, a small, warm bridge between them. As the prayer ended, and a peaceful silence settled over the room, Jonah looked up, his gaze moving from Ada's face to his father's. Then, in a voice loud enough for all the nearby pews to hear, a voice filled with a child's simple, profound certainty, he said the one word that contained his entire world: family. A few days later, Ada was on the porch of Cole's cabin, hanging freshly washed linens on the line. The afternoon sun was warm on her back, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and clean cotton. It was a scene of such simple, domestic peace that it made her heart ache with a happiness she had never known. She had been spending more and more time at the ranch, helping with chores, reading to Jonah, falling into a rhythm that felt more like home than any place she had ever been. Cole came out of the barn and walked over to her. Wiping his hands on a rag, he stood for a moment, just watching her, a soft light in his eyes. He was holding a small, crudely carved wooden box in his palm. It was a simple, unadorned thing, but he held it as if it were precious. He told her he had something for her. His voice was a little rough, a little uncertain. He was a man more comfortable with actions than with words. and she could feel the monumental effort it took for him to speak what was in his heart. He opened the small box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark wool, was not a ring. It was a single, milky white quartz stone, worn smooth by water and time. A simple leather cord was threaded through a small, carefully drilled hole. Ada recognized it instantly. It was a stone from the high meadow on Red Willow Pass, from the place where they had faced the storm together. Cole took a deep breath, his honest eyes holding hers. He told her that he did not have diamonds to offer, nor did he have deeds to any great fortune. All he had, he said, were his bare hands, to work for her and protect her, and his honest eye, to always see her and speak the truth. He offered her a promise, the only one he knew how to keep a promise, to always try to do the right thing, by her side. He asked her, his voice thick with emotion, if she would choose that. Tears welled in Ada's eyes, blurring the image of his strong, gentle face. She smiled, a radiant, watery smile that held all the love and admiration in her heart. She reached out and touched his cheek. She told him that she had already chosen. She had made her choice on the night of the prairie fire, when she had knelt in the ashes and tended to his burned hands and seen the unshakable goodness in his soul. In the distance, from the direction of Red Willow Pass, where the survey crews were now at work, the sound of a steam whistle echoed through the valley, a lonely, hopeful sound. From the schoolhouse in town came the faint, cheerful ringing of the dismissal bell, followed by the distant sound of children's laughter. The sweet, warm smell of cinnamon and baking bread drifted up from Mrs. Tabor's bakery, and on the horizon, a herd of horses, their silhouettes dark against the vibrant orange and purple of the setting sun, ran free across the land. Prosperity, Ada knew, was not something you could hold in your hand or lock in a vault. It was the quiet, steady accumulation of small, decent moments. It was the warmth of a shared home, the trust in a child's eyes, and the steadfast love of an honest man. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like this video, and press the hype button to help us share this story with more people.